So as you know, in this year we've been exploring the Dharma through stories, symbols and myths. And for the last few weeks we've been looking at the Wheel of Life as a sort of sub-theme within that. We've come to the end of that sub-theme. And this week we're launching a new sub-theme. A short series of just 4 talks, I think, on stories and parables from the White Lotus Sutra. Can you read that? From the White Lotus Sutra. So what I'm going to do tonight is introduce the White Lotus Sutra, because it's probably not quite anything you've ever come across before. And I'm also going to tell a couple of related stories from the White Lotus Sutra and explore what they might mean for us. So the White Lotus Sutra, for a start, the White Lotus Sutra is what is called a Mahayana Sutra. So it's a product of the Mahayana movement in Buddhism. Mahayana means great vehicle or great way. And it seems to have been partly an attempt to get back to the true spirit of the Buddha's teaching at a time when maybe bits of mainstream Buddhism had got a bit literalistic, a bit dry and skyly, a bit too focused on the recorded words of the Buddha at the expense of the spirit of his message. Maybe a bit too focused on individual liberation from negative states at the expense of practicing the Dharma to be a positive force in the world. So this style of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, spread into China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet, and most of the Buddhists who ever existed in the world have been Mahayana Buddhists. The only part of the Buddhist world where the Mahayana doesn't really dominate is Southeast Asia, places like Sri Lanka and Thailand, where the Theravada tradition is the main school. So Mahayana texts are generally written in Sanskrit, and they're called by the Sanskrit words sutra, compared to the Buddhist discourses that are written in the Pali language, which are called sutta. So this might sound a bit technical. It's quite big, it's something you probably need to know. The Pali suttas are the basis of the Theravadan tradition of Southeast Asia. And the Mahayana sutras are very different, often, from the Pali suttas. Pali suttas are usually quite down to earth. They usually start at a place that actually exists, and they say, well, the Buddha was staying in this particular place, and somebody came to see him. And somebody asked him this question, and this is what he said. And this is what the person said back, and then this is what the Buddha said. And sometimes the Buddha does something that makes it clear that he's not exactly an ordinary human, like maybe he takes them off to a completely higher realm and shows them something and brings them back. But usually that's not going on. Usually it's very clear that we're hearing the teachings of a historical figure who lived in a particular time and place that you can still go to. You can still go to that place. Pali suttas are probably as close as we can get to the words of the historical Buddha, although they were passed down for hundreds of years as an oral tradition before they were written down. And there's absolutely no doubt that bits were missed out, bits were distorted, and bits were added by people who thought they knew what the Buddha should have said. If only he'd had the time or something. So Pali suttas recognisably happen at a particular time and place, and they relate to a historical figure, the historical Buddha. But some Mahayana sutras are more like cosmic science fiction. And the White Lotus Sutra is one of them. Okay. Also, Pali suttas are quite short. I meant to bring up a copy of the White Lotus Sutra. Pali suttas are quite short, but a couple of pages maybe? Not some are a bit longer than that, some are just less than a page. You can use the White Lotus Sutra to replace the leg on your sofa. It's big, it's a big book. It's completely different, with all sorts of stuff in it. So, in Sanskrit, the name of this sutra is the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra. And Pundarika means white lotus. Sutra means sutra, discourse. Saddharma means the true Dharma, the real McCoy. The Dharma that transcends and includes all the other versions of the Dharma, and the Dharma that puts all other Dharma teachings into perspective. This is the real business. That's what it means. The oldest part of the sutra date back to, were written down, scholars reckon, between 100 BCE, before the Christian era, and 100 CE, 100 years after the beginning of the Christian era. Which is the same time period that the earliest Pali Sutras were written down. So it's not so much that the Mahayana in this represents a later tradition, as that it represents a different strand in the tradition. Maybe it reflects aspects of the Buddha's teaching that the writers of the Pali Sutras didn't think were important and chose to ignore. Anyway, the Lotus Sutra went on to become hugely influential and popular, especially in China and Japan, where whole schools of Buddhism were based on it, the Tiantai and the Tendai school. And the stories and parables in the Lotus Sutra just became an integral part of the way people sort of spoke and thought. Familiar to everybody. Next week, Surimati is going to tell us the parable of the burning house. And if you say, if you come across in a Buddhist text from Japan or China, the burning house, everybody knows what it means. Everybody knows that parable. Everybody knows that story. It's just part of culture. So for the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at some of these stories from the Lotus Sutra. And in fact, the Lotus Sutra itself is one huge story. It's one huge story with lots of other stories embedded in it. And this story of the Lotus Sutra starts supposedly on Vulture's Peak. So Vulture's Peak is an actual place in India. There are people here who've been there on pilgrimage. It's an actual place. And it features a lot in the Pali Canon. But the Vulture's Peak in the Lotus Sutra is not that place. It is not that physical place. It's more like another dimension. It's the dimension where the Buddha and his advanced followers live, where they look down on the goings-on in the city on the plain in the same way that the Buddha might have done physically, look down on the city from Vulture's Peak. So the Buddha is on Vulture's Peak that isn't Vulture's Peak, that's some other dimension. And he's there with a great assembly of followers, and they're not all human. There's all sorts there. I won't go into the details, but there's dragons and various sort of things like that, like you get in other dimensions. But a lot of people as well. And they're all sitting around the Buddha silently. This huge crowd of people and beings, and the Buddha sort of slightly up from them. And then something a bit surprising happens. The Buddha emits a ray of light from between his eyebrows. And this ray of light goes out in all directions. Bzzz, east, which way is east? That way. Bzzz, I don't know, which way is east? South, bzzz, north, bzzz, west, bzzz, up. Down. It goes out in all directions, and in all directions it illuminates all the world systems of the universe. You can just see them there, like people sitting in a room. The assembled company can just see all these world systems in all directions, illuminated by this ray of light going out from between the Buddha's eyebrows. Well, this gets the audience's attention. One of the audience asks his neighbour, what's all this about then? What's going on? And his neighbour, who just happens to be Manjusri, the archetypal bodhisattva of wisdom, says, well, I've been with the Buddha for eons and eons. And whenever I've seen him do this, he's gone on to tell his audience the real Dharma. So listen up. And then sure enough, the Buddha speaks. And he says, the teachings I have given you so far have not been the true absolute Dharma. Not the real McCoy. I taught you what I taught you because that was what you needed at the time. That was what you needed at the stage of development that you were at. The teachings I gave you are what Buddhists call skillful means, suited to your stage of development and designed to move you on from there. Now, I'm going to give you the real Dharma, the real McCoy. At which point, 5,000 monks, nuns, lay men and lay women walk out in disgust. They are convinced that they already know what the Dharma is, and they know what the truth is, and they are not interested in listening to anything that might mean that the way they understand things isn't the complete and absolute truth. They just don't want to know. And the Buddha doesn't try and stop them or call them back. In fact, he says, it is good that such arrogant ones have left the assembly. Now, the assembly consists of people who are receptive to the truth. So he calls them arrogant ones. So these people who have left are spiritually arrogant. They're people who think they know. So they aren't open to hearing what they don't know. There is a saying I've come across that thinking we already know costs us everything we don't know, which is almost everything. So this is a warning against thinking we already know. It's a warning against spiritual arrogance, a warning against thinking that we've now got the Dharma all tied up. And in a few tidy ideas, we've mastered it, we've got it organised, and we've got it all tickety-boo. It's saying, whoa, watch it. If we think that any teaching, if we think that the teaching of the spiral path or the teaching of the 5 niyamas is completely the last word in the Dharma, that this explains everything and there's nothing left to say, we should always remind ourselves that there is more. Reality is more wonderful and mysterious than the concepts we use to explain it to ourselves. We should always be open to the fact that there's more. So having shocked his audience and got rid of 5,000 of them, the Buddha then goes on to say, he goes on to explain a little bit, and he says that only a fully enlightened being can know, only a Buddha can know the nature of reality. And for this reason, all teachings are skillful means. All teachings are skillful means. They are ways to help people develop, suited to their current state of progress, their temperament, their past experience, their past karma, and so on. The Buddhas know where each of us is at, and so, and this is a verse from the Sutta, and so they teach with various reasonings and parables, by analytic arguments and precise terms, by metaphors and analogies, causing them to make progress joyfully, teaching some through discourses, or poems, or tales of former times, by miracles and wonders, and also by close reasoning, by parables and fables, and by intellectual commentaries. In other words, by whatever's going to work. By whatever's going to work for that person. It isn't that there's just one teaching, and one way to teach the Dharma, and one way to practice the Dharma, and everything else is wrong. If we think like that, then we're maybe in danger of being a bit like the walkers out. If somebody comes along and says, hey, but what about this? So then the Buddha links this teaching about skillful means, he links it back to an episode in the Pali Canon, shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment. So shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha has seen into the nature of things, and he thinks, well, I can't communicate this. I cannot communicate this to human beings. These ordinary humans can never see what I've seen in their present state. It would be like trying to explain, he didn't think this, but it would be like trying to explain chess to a dog. You know, I mean, it just ain't going to work. So he's thinking, well, what's the point then? What's the point? Maybe I'll just sit here and enjoy the bliss. So the story goes. But it's said that then he had a vision. He had a vision in which he saw all people as like lotuses in different stages of development. So lotuses are like water lilies, except bigger and more colourful. And like water lilies, they grow in really grubby water. And he had this vision of humanity as a lake of lotuses, some of whom were still like really down in the really stagnant mud, and some of whom were starting to come up through the water, and some of whom were quite a long way up through the water, and some of whom were actually got buds outside the water that were just in the sunlight and ready to open. And he saw that human beings were these sort of, if you like, growing organisms. And that some were ready to open in the light. So he thought, well, I can't tell people the nature of reality, but I can help people to grow to the point where they see reality for themselves. And for this reason, most of the Dharma is not an attempt to explain the nature of things, so much as a sort of horticultural manual for the growing of lotuses. When to put on the right fertiliser, etc., etc. So when we're a little seedling lotus, we need to work hard at putting our little roots down into the mud and getting a few leaves up. And then maybe later on, maybe we need to think about producing some flowers and then getting them up into the sunlight. And maybe for that we need a different fertiliser and a different temperature, a different teaching, if you like, at different stages, different practices. So the Buddha has said that I'm going to teach you the true Dharma. And what he's telling us is that the true Dharma, the real McCoy, is that we wouldn't understand the true Dharma even if he told it to us. And that what we really need right now are skillful means. What we need are ideas and practices that will help us to grow right now. The Dharma is skillful means. So that's the opening of the sutra, and it's quite a blast in itself. And it goes on from there, it gets even more cosmic later on. But embedded in that are loads of stories. They often happen when someone gets really inspired and the audience comes up and tells a story. So there's loads of stories embedded in it. It's an absolute treasure chest of wonderful stories. And several of the parables, several of the most famous parables from the Lotus Sutra are about this idea of skillful means. So, as I said, next week Surimati is going to talk about the burning house. And the burning house just takes us much deeper into this idea. The story of the burning house takes us much deeper into this idea of skillful means. What's that all about? So, the stories I'm going to explore this week, the two stories. Firstly, they both relate to wealth. The Lotus Sutra is like a treasure chest. It's got all sorts of treasure in it, and both of these stories are about treasure, they're about wealth. But I think before we even start, let's just sort of be clear that we're talking about spiritual wealth. They're using wealth as a metaphor for spiritual wealth, okay? Because if we get stuck on thinking, well, the sutra is saying that poverty is bad and riches are good, we can get all political about it and miss the point. Wealth is a metaphor here. It's a metaphor for spiritual wealth. And the second thing is that both these stories, I think, relate to skillful means. Or they relate to a particular idea, which I think can be skillful means. And that's the idea of Buddha nature. So according to this idea of Buddha nature, which is very prevalent and popular in some schools of Buddhism, we all have, as it were, a sort of Buddha within us, waiting to be uncovered. We all have Buddha nature. It's our essential effort, our essential nature, our true self, if you like, is to be a Buddha. Somewhere in our depths we have that nature of the Buddha. We all have Buddha nature, but it's usually covered over. That's quite a prevalent idea, especially in Far Eastern Buddhism, where the Lotus Sutra was quite influential. And I am going to say that I reckon this is a skillful means because it's an idea that might be useful to us, but which mustn't be taken literally. When we start taking an idea that works as skillful means literally, as absolute truth, we start getting fundamentalist about it. We start getting into all sorts of problems and going down all sorts of blind alleys. And I'm going to be really contentious here and say that I think, for some people, the idea of God could be a skillful means, okay? For some people, the idea that there's this helpful force in the universe could be a skillful means. You start taking that literally, you start taking that as absolute truth, you start flying planes into buildings and having jihads and things like that. You start taking skillful means ideas completely literally, you can do all sorts of silly things. You have to realise that they're skillful means. So these two stories explore the idea of Buddha nature, which I'm going to say is a skillful means. Could be really good, but we've got to watch out for the other side of it. And they both use this idea of material wealth as an analogy for spiritual wealth. So the first of the stories I want to look at is the story of the jewel in the robe. Okay, jewel in the robe. So the story goes that there are two very old friends. There are two very, very old friends who meet after having been parted for ages and ages. They haven't seen each other for years and years. And in the meantime, one of them has got very, very rich, and the other one has got very, very poor. And the rich friend has been living in this life of great happiness and ease, while the poor friend's been having to live in ugly, dirty places and do all sorts of dirty jobs just to make ends meet. So the two friends meet after not seeing each other for ages and ages. And they're delighted to see each other. Well, great, isn't it? Great. Let's go down the pub. So they go down the pub. Or they go down whatever the ancient Indian equivalent of the pub is. And down the pub they get very drunk. They get very drunk. Especially the poor friend. Maybe he hasn't had much practice at drinking. They get very drunk. So while they're a bit under the weather, the rich friend says to the poor friend, look, mate, look, my friend, I've got enough to last me a lifetime. I'm going to give you this priceless jewel. This priceless jewel. Sell this and you're made for life. Sell this, you're a rich man for life. You will never have to live in ugly, dirty places again. You'll never have to do dirty, horrible jobs you can do. You can put your energy to the best use you can find. So here's this jewel. But he looks at his friend and he thinks, oh, he's not exactly in the most reliable state of mind right now. If I just give him this, he's liable to lose it on the way home. So maybe he has it about his person, he gets some needle and thread and he sews the jewel into his friend's robe. He sews it into his friend's robe. And he says to him, look, in the morning, when you're feeling better, get this jewel out and sell it and you're a made man. You're a made man. Your life never needs to go back to that sort of hardship that you've been suffering. All your troubles will be over. But the poor friend is in fact so very drunk that the next morning he doesn't remember anything about any of this. He doesn't remember he has a priceless jewel sewed into his robe. And he goes about his life in exactly the same way that he's got used to going about it. He carries on living in ugly, unpleasant places. He carries on doing all sorts of dirty, unpleasant jobs, and the years pass by. And then after years and years and years, the two men meet again. And the rich man sees that his friend is even dirtier and even scruffier and looking even more harassed and downtrodden than when they last met. And he's astonished. He says, what's going on? What happened to the priceless jewel I gave you? And the poor friend says, what priceless jewel? The one I sewed into your robe. Look, here. Apparently the poor friend is so very poor that he hasn't even been able to buy a new robe in all these years. So the rich friend gets the priceless jewel out of his friend's robe, and the poor friend is amazed. All this time he's been living this hard, unpleasant life, when all the time he had a means to live a completely different, liberated life right under his nose, if only he had remembered it. So, of course, in this story, the priceless jewel is the Buddha nature. All the poor friend has to do is remember it's there, and his problems would have been over. So the parable seems to imply that that's true with the Buddha nature as well. That all we have to do is remember what we are really Buddhas, remember that we're really Buddhas, and it will be easy. It's as simple as that. Certainly the parable could be taken like that. So then the second story is also on this theme of Buddha nature, the higher self, if you like, but it has some very, very different implications. And this is the story of the son of a rich father, the rich man's son. So the rich man's son is a very, very rich father, but his son somehow gets separated from the family, and gets lost, and can't find his way home at all. He's completely out of touch with the family. While still a boy, this happens to him. And he's got no trade, he's got no family, he's got no resources, he's got no real way of making a living. So he lives as one of the lowest of the low. He sinks to the lowest strata of society, which in India at that time would have meant living a very, very difficult life indeed among the outcasts, the very lowest strata of society. Doing all the filthy jobs, being treated as though you were hardly human, living in dirty, disgusting conditions. In fact, probably being treated worse than the animals are treated. So he lives among people who are looked down on and don't have much self-esteem, actually. And he gradually comes to take on their ways. It's difficult to get an idea of this in our society. The closest I could come up with was maybe a young boy who spent his entire youth among street drinkers or something like that. So he would grow up to speak very coarsely, to swear every other sentence, to have terrible manners and social graces, to always be dirty and smelly, to feel a bit shy and out of place among respectable people, not have a great deal of self-esteem or personal dignity. And the boy lives like this for years and years and years, until the sutta says his lowly status becomes second nature. He's so used to it, that's what he is, it's his second nature. He completely forgets that he comes from a rich, cultured family. He forgets his old, rather gracious, refined ways that he's been taught, his ways of speaking and acting. And that's who he is. As far as he's concerned, that's who he is. And then one day, quite by chance, he passes his father's palace. He's looking for work and he passes the gates of his father's palace. And he looks in the gate and he sees this figure of his father in his wonderful robe sitting on what's almost a throne, surrounded by aristocratic people. It's like, yourself having been down the allotment and you walk past the gates of Buckingham Palace. There's David Cameron or something, I don't know. And there's various people. And you don't sort of feel like going in and saying, hi, can I have thanks for the shampoos, He feels, oh my God, I better get out of here, actually. I better get out of here. If they see me hanging around here, they just think I'm trying to nick something. They don't want people like me around. So I'll get out of here. I'll get out of here quick. But the father spotted him, and the father recognises him after all these years. And he says to a couple of his friends, a couple of his servants, in fact, go get him, that's my son, get my son. The son legs it off down the road. And the two servants, who haven't exactly been given very detailed instructions, except get that man, leg it after him, tackle him, and knock him out. So the father catches up with him. He's like, oh, well, that wasn't exactly what I meant. It says in the sutta, he sees that his son has got a very low opinion of himself and is scared and out of place. He wouldn't be any use just saying, hey, you're my son, come in, join the party, have some champers. That wouldn't work. He sees that he's got to do something to sort of woo his son back, to raise his level of being. So he lets his son go home, and it says in the sutta he sends 2 servants to offer him a job. 2 servants of doleful and undignified appearance who are ugly and squat. And they offer him a job doing the sort of thing he's used to. They offer him a job cleaning the dirt shoveling the dirt from the outhouses. Okay, so what the lowest of the low do. But he says, well, I'll give you double pay. I'll give you double pay. So hey, he gives him the sort of job that he's used to, but a bit more pay, a bit more reward. So the son goes to the palace and he shovels dirt. He shovels outhouse dirt from one place to another for years and years and years. And the father, it said, looks out the palace window and sees him doing this and feels incredibly sorry for his son and wants to get close to him. So he thinks, oh, okay, how am I going to get close to him? If I just go and see him, he'll think, oh my God, it's the Lord, help, get me out of here, he's going to tell me off. So I'm going to pretend to be a workman. So I'll pretend not to be someone who's so far above him, as it were, socially, that he's just terrified. I'll pretend to be someone who's just maybe a bit more dignified than him, a bit more refined and dignified than him, a bit more mature. I'll pretend to be a foreman. So he dons foreman's clothes and he goes and says, hey, I'm the new foreman. You're working for me. Get shoveling. And in fact, he does say that. Actually, he starts out telling his son off. Come on, work a bit harder. Get on with it. You're not being given double pay for nothing. But then gradually he gets close to him. Gradually he sort of befriends him, influences him. He gets him doing less and less dirty jobs. He says, oh, you're doing quite well at this. How about shoveling something that's not quite so noxious? Gets him better pay, doing less and less dirty jobs. Gets him to leave behind some of his coarse ways. Gets his trust. Gradually sort of acts as a bit of a role model and a friend for the son, and gradually sort of moves up his level of being, if you like. And when he's got his trust, this is after a very, very long time of working, shoveling the dirt and whatnot, he actually reveals himself to his son. He says, look, I am actually I'm the gaffer. And I've taken a liking to you. I'm going to give you a job in the palace. So a while ago he would have been absolutely terrified of a job in the palace. He just wouldn't have gone anywhere near it. But now he's got better self-esteem. He can handle himself better. He's more refined. He's left behind some of his coarse habits. He holds himself better. So he doesn't feel like a tramp at a Buckingham Palace garden party anymore, which is how he would have felt before. So he goes and works in the palace. And he starts to get used to being in this beautiful environment. He's exposed to a beautiful environment such as he can't remember ever experiencing. Maybe he hears really beautiful music being played. He probably comes across beautiful art and statuary. So his tastes change, his tastes gradually refine. He starts to appreciate things he could never previously have appreciated. The father puts him in charge of his treasures, so he gets to handle beautiful treasures, beautiful things. He gets used to handling beautiful things, as though they were his own almost. And eventually the father says, I'm going to make you my steward. I'm going to make you my general manager. You can handle all my business, etc., my lands, everything. So he ends up dealing with VIPs and aristocrats, but now he's not feeling shy and out of place. This person who once would have not been able to look these people in the eye, who would have probably wiped his nose on his sleeve and asked for some money for a drink, he now feels an equal. He feels an equal. He feels he can look these people in the eye. He doesn't feel anything wrong with himself. He's a different person. He's a different person to what he was decades ago now. And eventually the father realises, well, he's going to die. He's going to die. And he organises a huge assembly, a great party. He invites the nobs and the nobles and the VIPs and the rich from miles and miles around to this great meeting, this great party. And when he's got them there, he gets up on the stage and he says, "This man is my son. This man is my true son. And I am giving him herewith all my wealth, my palace, my gardens, my artworks, my jewels, my elephants, my whatever, my farms. I'm giving him all of this, and I'm going to go away and die. It's all his." And the son is amazed. The son is, "Well, where does this come from?" And the son says, "Well, I'm amazed I've got all this without doing anything to earn it. It's all just come to me, like that." But of course he's been earning it for years and years and years. He's been earning it with all that shoveling and then all that stewarding and all the other things he's been doing. Constantly stepping out of his comfort zone, the person he thinks he is, constantly stepping into bigger shoes and then filling them, constantly putting on bigger robes and filling them. So I reckon this story, the story of the rich man's son, has a different take on Buddha nature. It's a different take on Buddha nature. They're both in the same sutta. So Sangha is doing his commentary on this in a book called The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, which I absolutely heartily recommend. He says, well, the Father is the higher self. The Father is the higher self, if you like, the Buddha nature. The Son is the person who is cut off from his true nature, cut off from his true nature, which is symbolised by being rich. He's cut off from that. He's lost contact with it. Who's learned to think of himself as a lowly being. Learned to think of himself as a coarse, lowly being. As with the story of the jewel, he's forgotten who he really is. He's forgotten who he really is. He's forgotten his Buddha nature. But whereas in the story of the jewel in the robe, all the guy has to do is get the Buddha nature out of his robe. All he has to do is remember that it's there. And he's quits in, he's sorted. The story of this rich man's son makes it clear that it isn't as easy as that. It's not as easy as that. It's not just that we've forgotten who we really are, and then as soon as we remember it, we're okay. We've forgotten who we really are, and we've been living and acting for years and years, and maybe lifetimes and lifetimes, in a way which is beneath us. We've acquired all sorts of not very good habits, in a way that's coarsened and degraded us, eroded our self-esteem, so that being spiritually poor has become second nature, as being materially poor was said to be second nature to the rich man's son. It's not enough for the son to know he's the rich man's son. He's got to, he would still wipe his nose on his sleeve and swear every other sentence. He's got a lot of work to do to raise the level of his being, and we've got a lot of work to do to raise the level of our being, metaphorically shoveling the stuff from the outhouses. Leaving behind coarse, unskillful habits, refining ourselves, gradually opening up to the Father, if you like, gradually being influenced by something that's a bit of a role model to us, gradually opening ourselves up then to spiritual riches, to spiritual beauty, going into the palace, taking on more and more responsibility. So what that is saying is, yes, maybe we have Buddha nature, but it is well and truly buried. We've got a lot of practice to do to make it a reality. So, two stories about Buddha nature, if you like. And I'd just like to just say something about Buddha nature, because I reckon Buddha nature is a skill. The idea of Buddha nature is a skillful means. It's a metaphor, which mustn't be taken literally, and it could be a very positive metaphor. So it could be a very positive metaphor because it gives us confidence in our ability to grow and develop, for a start. So if the guy knew he was the rich man's son, then maybe he would have found it easier to move in that direction. So it gives us confidence in our ability to grow and develop. Sometimes maybe we think, well, I couldn't become enlightened, I'm just this nobody, really. But it gives us confidence, self-esteem. might give us a sense of being in touch with guidance from somewhere higher than our current self. Maybe we get intuitions, and it would give us some way of explaining that. Why do I have a sense that it's right to move in that direction? It could give us a sense of respect for others as well, because if we've got Buddha nature, I don't suppose we're unique. If we've got Buddha nature, everybody's got Buddha nature. Everybody is a potential Buddha. We should be treating everybody as a Buddha, if you like. We should be treating everybody as an object of great respect. If we have it, they have it too. They deserve as much respect as we do. But if that idea is taken literally, it could be quite destructive, actually. At worst, some people, and this actually does happen, at worst, I've heard people say this: I am already a Buddha, so I don't need to practice. My job in the advertising agency is my practice. And, I don't need to do anything special. In fact, it would be a mistake, because I'm already a Buddha. I just need to realise I'm already a Buddha and I'm fine. And I realise it. Hey, so I'm already a Buddha. Let's go down the pub. Well, a slightly less daft version is, which is much more common actually, is I already have Buddha nature, so all I have to do is relax and let it manifest. So in meditation, all I have to do is stop making an effort, just sit, and my Buddha nature will manifest. I will be a Buddha. Lots of people actually subscribe to that one. And of course, just sitting just becomes just drifting and just imagining and just getting very, very inflated about who we are if we're not careful. We actually need to make effort to develop on the spiritual path. We need to shovel. And we need to gradually sort of move up that scale. So, potentially really beneficial idea, but also potentially really dangerous idea. For me, if I think about myself, I think I need an idea that validates a feeling I have of having a sort of intuitive spiritual sense of direction, of sort of knowing what I need to do, feeling that I know which way I need to go, as though I'm almost being called by something a bit higher than myself. I have that sort of, if you want to call it messages from a higher self, I seem to have had those. I seem to just have that sense that, I knew that I wanted to get involved in the Dharma the minute I came across it, for example. I knew that this was right for me. There's things like that, just where's it coming from? I need an idea that validates that. And maybe Buddha nature would, but I think actually it's better to think dynamically in terms of potential. It is not the case that somewhere in me there's a sort of little Buddha. Yeah, it's just not there. This is a metaphor. And actually, I am not a thing with a thing in me. I am a dynamic process. So it's better to think dynamically in terms of potential. So we were talking about this last night in Mitra study, actually, and we came up with the metaphor of a beech tree. So if you take a beech tree and a beech seed, it is implicit in the nature of a beech seed, a beech mast, to grow towards that beautiful thing, which is a fully grown beech tree. They are gorgeous. It is implicit in the nature of that seed to grow towards that tree. But there is no beech tree in that beech seed. There's no beech tree in that beech seed, but it is always part of the nature of that beech seed and everything it becomes to grow towards that tree. Everything it does, at every stage, is as though there was an urge to do the next thing that moves it towards being that tree. If you chop it down and make it into a hedge with other beech trees and then leave it, it will grow towards being a beech tree. If you topiarize it into a chicken and then leave it, it will grow towards being a beech tree. It always, speaking metaphorically, seems to know what it's driven to become. There's no beech tree nature. Well, there is, sort of, but there's no little beech tree in the beech mast. There's the potential It's its nature to grow towards being a beech tree. And I think that is a better metaphor, actually, a more useful metaphor for us. We have that potential. We have that potential, and that potential gets through to us. It sends us, if you like, messages. We know what we need to do in the same way that the growing beech tree seems to know what to do. The urge to grow towards enlightenment is the equivalent of the urge of the beech tree to grow towards being a dirty, great big forest tree, beautiful forest tree. It tells us which way to go. And this urge, I think it's best to think of this urge as what we call Shraddha. So this word Shraddha is often translated as faith, but it isn't really faith. It's our sense of connection, with something higher than ourselves. It's what makes us think, yeah, that's right, I want that. Sangha actually describes it as sort of resonance of what's highest in us with what's highest in the universe. We could say it's the voice of our inner beech tree. It's the voice of, that's what you need. It's almost as though the future that we could become is calling us. And it calls us through our Shraddha, our intuitive sense of what's the right direction. So I think if there's a lesson from this, if there's a sort of moral to this, it's to learn to listen and trust a bit our Shraddha, actually, our sense of our intuitive sense of rightness. And I think the way we do that is, well, all the ways that we practice, actually, because my experience is that I am much more in touch with my Shraddha if I meditate. I'm much more in touch with my Shraddha if I study the Dharma, expose myself to the Dharma. I'm much more in touch with my Shraddha if I spend time around the Sangha and my spiritual friends. We might think we do all those things to get insight, but I think we actually do all those things because it awakens our Shraddha, it strengthens our Shraddha. We start to hear more and more that little voice that's sort of saying, oh, that way, no, not that way, that way. So I think we need to sort of maybe step out of our sort of Western rationalism for a bit and accept that we can know things intuitively, we can know things with heart knowledge, and there are ways that we can deepen our heart knowledge and get closer to it and listen to it. And that is also one of the messages of the Lotus Sutra, because the Lotus Sutra tells us, and the Buddha tells us in the Lotus Sutra, we cannot know the truth about reality. But he also says the closest we get to that is our Shraddha, our heart knowledge. So we know what to do next. Our potential is always trying to manifest. It's always trying to get through to us, telling us in a still, quiet voice which way we need to go. We just need to learn to listen to it. And of course, one of the ways we need to listen to it is meditation, because it's a very quiet voice, but we can hear it.